in the past, it used to be like the West was coming to Africa. Now it's the East,
Mm.
China and the likes coming to Africa. And it's not just even about policies this time or influencing policies, I mean, it goes beyond that to even things like infrastructure, right? Building roads, rails. Many times, working on the streets of Nigeria, you would see the Chinese construction company. You see their construction works all over different places
When you
of
see
the
them,
country.
is it the Chinese companies? Do they have Chinese workers, or are you seeing Nigerians
Yeah,
also?
so mostly Chinese workers, and I think those are issues that still needs to be discussed, not just in Nigeria but even in other African countries. That how do you ensure that there's some sort of skills transfer? It doesn't look like you're just bringing your workers to do projects. Of course, there are cases where Nigerians would also be employed in some of these projects, but I think that's where government policies then come in. Like, how do you ensure that before you sign some of these contracts, whether it's loan contract, infrastructure project, and all of that, there has to be some skills transfer, local content. How much of local resources do you get to use in implementing those projects? So I think that's where it'll make sense for policies to intervene. But I see. I mean, I could give examples of some of the projects, right? So in Lagos State, where I live in Nigeria, you would see that they've just completed the one of the rail lines, right? And it was, supported by the Chinese, built by the Chinese, and supported by the Chinese. So you could see that, right? So when we talk about the West versus Africa and the East versus Africa, I think I prefer a model where development is physical, where you could see impact of projects, right? So driving through, you could point to that project, the rail, you would see the trains moving, and then you could say this was a product of partnerships. Of course, loans were involved, but this was a product of partnership between Nigeria and China or a Chinese company. It's evident, right? People use it every day and see that. So I think that's where it has to go. We need to move away from this idea of extractive nature, which has always been the case, from the 60s and 70s, where it's almost about your raw materials and what you have. And we just want to exploit that, but it needs to move in forms of towards things like infrastructure, projects, power supply, investment in even education, healthcare, and all of that. And I think that's part of where it's moving towards. Hopefully it'll get better, and there will be lots of technology transfer that could happen,
Mm.
skills transfer as well, employing local labor, so that we would not even need the Chinese to do similar projects in other states, for instance. It's something that Nigerians can own from start to finish. I'm not saying they can't do that already, but we need to do that in a much more larger scale, just so development can be felt
Mm.
by the people. Yeah, so I think over time, if you look at the West, the relation, not just the West, even the some of the institutions,
Mm.
right? They operate on ideologies. In some cases, some of these things do not really reflect or do not really understand the local problems, right? So you could have a group leaning towards trade liberalization, open your borders, free trade, not necessarily looking at the cost, to the local economy. And in fact, if I take you back to the 80s, right, and 70s and 80s, what you'd find is that whilst people would argue that, whether it's import substitution versus export oriented industrialization, you would see that in the 70s, many African countries were focused a lot more on import substitution, right? They were looking inwards. Imagine many of the countries that got independence. So there was this national movement. In fact, they were in indigenization policy, states, government owned projects, were delivering projects and all of that. But where Africa got different, where the trajectory was different between Africa and East Asia, was that it got to a point where some of these countries started looking outwards, right? And they saw that, look, I think we've protected enough. We've done import substitution enough. Why don't we test our minds and look elsewhere? And in fact, with the HCI in Korea, the heavy chemical industries, they started investing in steel and all of those things, exporting shipbuilding, exporting to other countries. So, and at the same time, they also did some import substitution policies as well. But what I'm just trying to get at is they protected their industries well enough to the point that they thought we can now withstand competition and we can export to the rest of the world, right? But for Africa, I think that's where we stopped. So after that import substitution policy, there was not enough effort to transition towards the export oriented industrialization. I think that's part of the problem. And then coupled with the impact of the structural adjustment programs, which leads to the point you just talked about, the role of Western institutions or international development institutions, that when the structural adjustment programs were introduced across many African countries, the fact was that many of these countries were not ready to liberalize their exports. They hadn't built that capacity strong enough, like the East Asians, to withstand the competition from goods coming from elsewhere. And so, if you check the growth trajectory of many African countries, right, in fact, manufacturing as a share of GDP started declining after many after the structural adjustment programs were implemented. And so, you still see some of those happening today, where policies are made based on ideologies rather than based on whether it suits the local economy. And I think that's a big problem. And that's one of the things that, some of these international development institutions do. And then it has to stop. And it has to be challenged by African governments, using evidence, building a research resource base that can counter some of these arguments that are being put forward by these institutions. Otherwise, you will just, sing to the tunes of these institutions at the detriment of your local industries.